Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks for being here today. I hope you had a chance. Thank you. I do hope you had a chance to sign in. That helps us to document who is here, especially if you're here for continuing education credits. That allows us to document that. And then if you have questions on what types of continuing education credits you can earn, feel free to talk to me after the presentation, or you can email us at asktrek@pdx.edu. And we're happy to give you more information. We will be recording today's seminar as well as streaming it live online. So thank you for tuning in online for those who are at home. If you have any questions, you can type those into the questions pane of the GoToWebinar module on the right-hand side of your screen. And then I just wanted to point out that our next seminar is Friday, March 8th. Chris Pengalanen from Uber will be visiting us to present public transportation and new mobility. And I also wanted to highlight our summer IBTI workshops here in Portland. Let's see if I can get the right slide to show. But it is an immersive experience here in Portland. There's 3 different sessions we have. One is for university professors, one is a comprehensive bikeway design program, and one is specifically for planning active transportation programs in your community. And so today I'm really happy to introduce our guest from the Washington State Department of Transportation, Barb Chamberlain. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good to be with you all. I'm excited to talk about words in part because my first degrees were in English and linguistics. And a lot of people who work in transportation, I find, not to overdo the metaphor, but we take interesting paths to get to where we are in transportation. So mine went through serving as an elected official and working in higher ed communications. So being back on a campus is pretty familiar territory. And what I've found in everything that I've done is that if I can find the words that resonate for people, if I can come up with some way to find common ground, that we might get maybe just an inch more towards a common understanding. The Venn diagram doesn't always have a big overlap, but it may at least touch sort of at the pixel margin there. And so I look for the ways that we use words to be indications of what do we believe, what are our attitudes. The ways that we use these words can either reflect our attitudes or they can actually shape our attitudes. And I would say as a society, we have certainly been on a journey, some people maybe pedaling or rolling a little bit faster than others, on changing the words we use and who we include and who we exclude through our language. So I want to start with a couple of examples that are actually sort of not transportation, and yet at the same time, they are things that we do when we go to present at a meeting or talk with our friends or whatever it is. The first thing is, if I were to say to this whole room, hey gals, how's it going? It's all good, right? You all feel totally included when I say, hey gals. Very, very common for people to say, hey guys, and think that that means everybody in the room, and actually doesn't. If you came up to me and said, hey guy, how's it going today? I'd be like, no. And even guy, gal, that's a gender binary anyway. So if we could move away from gender labels for a room full of people, we are including everybody. Folks, colleagues, friends. I'm not from the South, but I use y'all, all y'all for a big group. So you can do that and have people realize, yes, I'm in this room and you actually recognize that I'm here. There are other ways that we use words to include or exclude that are a lot more sort of invisible to us, perhaps a little more implicit than explicit. So if I tell you about how I learned to ride a bike, I can lay out this whole personal story, lovely story, grew up with the one with the sparkles and the streamers, and it goes on. And in all of that, what I am not saying, but is there, is that my parents could afford to buy me a new bike every time I outgrew the one I had. And I had a place I could ride. And they didn't worry about me going out the door on my bike. So there's a whole life experience that I bring to that learning to ride a bike piece that not everybody brings. And yet we'll talk about something as if our experience is a universal experience. And so if we can recognize that too and say, oh, maybe that didn't work that way for everybody, then we can use a way of just talking about transportation that's more inclusive. There's a quote I use a fair amount of the time too, especially if I'm talking with people who've been doing this for quite a while, to say what you know may be actually getting in the way of recognizing the things that you don't know. And this particular quote is from a graphic designer. And so she says, what I find the most difficult is separating what I know right away from what I may not be seeing because I know too much. And yet, when she says that, she's a graphic designer. Yes, she uses her visual senses to do her work. But you could also say, what I may not be recognizing because I know too much. Because she just used a metaphor that refers to a particular sensory experience in the world that not everybody shares. So I don't tell you this to say, oh, you've got to just pick your way through the minefield of language. Every place you step is loaded with problems for you. But just to point out, we don't even know when we do this. And so if we start to think and we're a little more mindful with our words, doesn't cost you a thing except attention. And that's maybe the most precious coin of all. What I want to do today is give you a few ideas for ways to think about whether we are reading media coverage and responding to it, whether we are reviewing our own work in a transportation plan or a project, something we're about to put out to the public. When you put that out, what are the responses you're going to get from somebody saying, but where am I in this? So if you can use some of these tools, I will say some of them I think may feel overly obvious, but they may not be obvious to somebody you work with. So you could take it back and say, you know, I just want to give you a little food for thought here. So the first approach I suggest is thinking like a scientist. And what I have on the screen is a couple of quotes from the codes of ethics for engineers and for planners. And if you look at them, they say we're supposed to tell you everything that's relevant, everything that's pertinent. And yet I can tell you when I was a bike advocate and going to a meeting and looking at a presentation and saying, but what does this mean for me on my bicycle? It's not there. That was the information that was relevant or pertinent for me. Or I'm somebody in a wheelchair and I am looking at your rendering of the street and you didn't draw in any curb cuts. Where is the information for me in that? And so thinking about what is clear for everybody, what is relevant for everybody, you might have to write a little more, you might have a slightly longer presentation, but then you're including everybody. So as an example of this, you'll see more than one Ian Lockwood cartoon. Thank you, Ian, wherever you are. He's a transportation engineer who gives us all great fodder to mock what we do. Providing context is the job. So you say, these poor parents are saying there's too much traffic for Billy to walk to school, so we drive him. Well, this is, sorry, Ian, still actually kind of a car-centric cartoon. Because if that traffic were a bunch of kids walking to school, I bet Billy could walk to school. If that traffic were a bunch of kids on bikes, maybe Billy doesn't have a bike, but I bet Billy could walk to school. So traffic is not inherently people in cars. Traffic is traffic. So this is actually a problem of motor vehicle traffic inducing motor vehicle traffic. If this were bike traffic inducing bike traffic or walking traffic inducing walking traffic, we would not have a problem for Billy's parents. And Billy would be getting his healthy activity. Another thing you can do when you're thinking like a scientist as we look at these things is call it out every time you see correlation masquerading as causation. And this happens a ton. People put two pieces of information next to each other. And because they're next to each other, they must somehow belong together. One must mean the other is a result. And we have Ford Motor Company to thank for coining a dreadful term. I said I majored in English and linguistics. When people coin new words, sometimes it's really useful. Sometimes it's a really beautiful word. This one's not so beautiful. Pedestrian. Yeah, it's not a thing. It's just not a thing. What it means is person walking with a phone or rolling with a phone. And they put it out there to warn us all about the incredible danger of these people who are using a phone while they move around. They possibly are even chewing gum at the same time. I mean, who knows what could be creating the dangers here. And they did get called out on it pretty quickly. But then people started using it to sell things. This is a company that is selling signs. And they want to warn you about avoiding the dangers of pedestrians on your property. So apparently I don't want to go spend my money there because I would have to be on the sidewalk approaching them with the phone I'm using to find the business. So there's a lot of sort of mockery of people doing something that's pretty ordinary now. They did get jumped on a fair amount for this. And when you think about what actually causes the injury to me, if I am that pedestrian holding my phone, it's probably not the act of holding my phone. That's just a correlation. Another thing we do a lot, another place this happens a lot is with information about impairment. And you will see reports of how many pedestrian fatalities in particular involve an impaired pedestrian. So let me give you a scenario. I go out to dinner with my friends. I have 2 glasses of wine. I am going to take the bus home because we've told me not to drink and drive. A really good thing to tell me. So I walk out of the restaurant. I have my phone. I'm using the One Bus Away app to find my bus. And the light changes. So I've got the little, white icon in the crosswalk. That's mine. I understand human nature. So I do actually look both ways before I start to cross that street. Even though it's mine, that space is mine right now. And somebody else in an SUV who had 2 glasses of wine and is holding their phone looking for where they're going too. So we're doing the exact same things. Runs the red light and hits me and kills me. I now show up in the statistics as an impaired pedestrian and a pedestrian with a cell phone, neither of which has anything to do with the fact that I died. So that's correlation. And if the driver is one of the rising number of hit and runs, we know nothing about that person. So watch when we're using data and how we are telling a story. What is the implicit story we're telling? There was one, I'm sorry, I have to call out a bike advocacy group for doing this, but on Twitter, they put out this thing about the Netherlands passing a new law, cycling with a cell phone, using a cell phone while you're cycling will be illegal. The fine is set to prevent accidents, we will come back to that word, as half of the Dutch population admits to occasionally using the phone on the bike, admits this nefarious behavior. So this one on Twitter, 47 retweets, 76 people clicked the little heart button to say, this is really great information. People said, wait, tell us more. So when you follow up, you find out only 1% of the people going to a first aid station were actually using a cell phone while they biked. So we went from 50% of the people to 1%. This tweet gets 6 retweets and 10 likes. So which piece of information is out there with everybody thinking, oh my gosh, those biking, texting Dutch, they're just a danger to themselves and others. So correlation is not causation. Another profession we can borrow from is to think like a good journalist. And I say good journalist because there is a lot of research coming out now to talk to us about how media coverage really frames things to blame the person who ends up dead, to blame the person who crossed at the only chance they had to cross because they're trying to shoot a gap in the traffic or whatever it is they're doing. So if you take these rules that journalists are taught, you're supposed to be telling a story that gives us the who, what, when, where, why, how. If you do that and you lay that against the work you're putting out, whether it's a plan or a project, or you're reading a story saying, does this story actually tell me all of these things? Again, that sort of complete, relevant, specific information. Because it often does not. Some of the research here is really startling and sad, really, to read, that our friends and neighbors are reading things and thinking, well, it was their fault. They were wearing a dark coat. I have a charcoal gray overcoat. And every time I get out of a car, a bus, a train, whatever I'm in, I am still wearing my dark coat. So if I die, it's my fault. That is what media framing often gives us. They don't tell us often anything about the infrastructure or the context of this transportation mode we're using. So if you're a good journalist and you're running through those who, what, when, where, why, how questions, you'll get more of that context. And we'll get the links out to these stories and research that give you some advice on how not to do this and point out some of the ways that there's problematic coverage, either explicitly or implicitly blaming people. Now I'll come back to Ian again. Wherever he is, he's blushing. He did a nice piece in the ITE Journal a couple of years ago about language bias in transportation. And he took a table of words that are pretty commonly used, like accident, said don't say accident, say collision or crash, capacity, demand, enhanced, efficiency, all these great transpo words, right? And he said there's some bias in there. So he defines them a little bit more, and he's mode specific. So he says, oh, by capacity, we mean maximum motor vehicle volume. By efficiency, we mean increased speeds. And I think he got halfway there. I do not think he got all of the way there, because I can go through this list and I can see a whole bunch of words that are not inherently at all about movement of people in cars or freight trucks or whatever motor vehicle you're talking about. That efficiency could be cubic volume, geometric efficiency. It could be per seat cost efficiency. Efficiency in and of itself does not mean driving faster. Capacity in and of itself does not mean maximum motor vehicle capacity. And if you've ever walked on a crowded sidewalk or biked on a path or bike lane that's full of people, there's a capacity question. So these are neutral words. And so if we define them to be mode specific, then we're being more clear, but we shouldn't assume from the get-go that they actually are just about people in cars. So I'm going to run through a few examples of some of this who, what, when, where, why business, and then show you some of the applications. And again, I think some of this will feel really, really glaringly obvious, share it with somebody for whom it is not quite so obvious. So the who. I will occasionally use modal labels that's sometimes sort of space efficient. It is sometimes because a formal report structure says that, so you would refer to pedestrians and bicyclists. But I do not, in just everyday language, talk about myself as a cyclist or a biker, which could also be, if we're stereotyping, somebody on a motorcycle. We can talk instead about people. These are people who are using bicycles. If we say walking and rolling, we are including not only bicycling, but other sort of little rideables and any kind of mobility assistance device. So we're talking about everybody who's in that space. People moving freight. In the who, if we stay away from stereotypes, I think we help broaden the conversation and the understanding about who is doing what. These are just people trying to get somewhere. Some of you may have seen a few articles recently. The largest number of, or the largest percentage of bicycle use is among people living in households that have less than 10,000 a year household income. That is not the person who comes to mind if you use the word cyclist. I think I know what may come to mind as a cyclist stereotype, and it's not that person. So this is, again, people relying on these forms of transportation. And because everybody is people, this is another way of finding that little overlap in the Venn diagram. You don't want to kill me. You don't want to kill your neighbor. You don't want to kill people if your actions are making the difference here. And I end up talking a lot about safety examples because that is so much of the work we do now. We've seen startling numbers, and I'll share a couple of statistics from Washington State, that pedestrian and bicyclist serious injuries and fatalities are just going up at an unacceptable rate, and we are the canary in the coal mine. So when I talk about this in the context of safety, it applies to whether you're talking about mobility or equity or any of the reasons for doing a project. I just tend to go to these examples a lot because they're so important to talk about. One of the things we can do when we talk about who is experiencing these things is to use a demographic analysis that really looks at disparities and say, this is not just this person in isolation, this is this person in a context that means a lot of people have a higher risk of something happening. There was coverage a couple of years ago, and I just found this, and I'm looking for other studies, and if anybody knows of more studies on this, I would really like to find them. This particular study looked at the risk of dying if you are in a wheelchair and struck by a driver. And it's a 36% higher chance of dying. In 75% of the cases they studied, there is no indication that the driver did anything to avoid it. There's no evidence of braking. There's no evidence they swerved. There's no evidence they saw that person at all. So that is a risk factor for us to talk about and say, what about that street could have changed it? So that driver actually was moving at a speed appropriate to the conditions, could see the person there. What was the lighting like? What was the shrubbery like? All of these things that are the where. In this case, the who is a person who is more vulnerable to those impacts. Now, because the list is always listed as who, what, when, where, why, I talked about the who first. But there is a big what, and that is, what is transportation? And the term alternative transportation is one I X out. They are all alternatives, and transportation in and of itself doesn't mean driving. It used to mean, using your feet, riding a horse, oxen pulling a cart, paddling a canoe. There are so many forms of transportation. So it's just transportation. So whether you are walking or rolling, you are using some transportation. Mode is a little bit wonky. But if we say choices, that also implies that everybody has choices. So I'm thinking about the word, do we really mean that? Does everybody we're talking about have choices? What is it we're trying to accomplish, and for whom? Non-motorized has the same problems as alternative. Not everything is non-motorized. And one more on the alternative thing. Secretary Millar, head of WashDOT the other day, and he said this a couple of times, said walking and biking are not alternative transportation any more than women are alternative men. So we all have all our choices in this, but some are not more highly valued than others if we're being fair, if we're being balanced across all the modes. The term active transportation, I feel like that has some problems for us too, because there are people in this, I would say, sort of zone of vulnerability who are maybe not active. Maybe they're using something that's got a battery, maybe they're in a motorized wheelchair. I still consider them sort of part of my portfolio in this work. They're in this place where they are not protected by a hard shell. They are moving at a speed that is slower than the bigger boxes next to them. And the fatalities and serious injuries, when they get hit, they have less protection around them. So I'm on the AASHTO Council on Active Transportation, and we started out saying, so what's in our portfolio as a council? And we have kind of a draft working understanding that we are talking about bicycling, we are talking about walking, and we are talking about using something that is a personal, portable, sort of human scale sized thing with wheels, whether that's an assistive device, a personal device, whatever somebody is inventing in their basement tomorrow to get a venture capitalist all excited. It's kind of in this realm. It may or may not be motorized. The what, this comes back a bit to Ian's table of when you're talking about traffic congestion. If you mean single occupancy motor vehicle congestion, let's say that, because now you've defined a different problem. Now you can think about, well, how would we solve that particular problem? Is it that it's single occupancy? We could do something about that. And yes, that's a longer phrase. A lot of this involves more words. Sorry about that. No catchy acronyms. I tried really hard to have a catchy acronym for little personal wheeled thingies, rideables. So if you have one of those, let me know that too. In the realm of what, if we identify what really happens, we do some things, and back to my English major roots, we are better writers if we do this too. We use clear terms and we use the active voice, not the passive voice. So you don't say it was an accident, because an accident is something that cannot be prevented or avoided. It is a crash. For fun or not so fun, on Twitter, search on the hashtags crash not accident and driver not car. And especially with the rise of autonomous vehicle discussions. If we're going to say the car hit the person, sometimes it is a car that hit the person. Or it is the software engineers and the hardware engineers who built the car that ultimately hit the person. The rest of the time, it's somebody at the wheel. You hope they're at the wheel. We do not use the passive voice on other things. We don't say the knife chopped the vegetables. We do not say the bat hit the ball, scored the RBIs, and was later entered into the Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame. We're really clear in any form of sports ball that we have somebody doing something and they get to take credit. So let's do that in transportation too. It is a driver who does something. Now, in the circumstances of any individual crash or traffic movement, there are other contributing circumstances. I am not saying this is all about blaming drivers and absolving everybody else. But if you say, this is what the driver did, and you get to, why did the driver do that? Oh, bad lighting, shrubs overgrown onto that crosswalk so they couldn't see the sign, whatever's going, like you're gonna look at all of this. So this is not to blame, it is to be clear. Now, as I said, English major, I do say for whom. If you wanna say who for, you just do that. There are no points off for saying who for. But if you use this test and you add it to all of these others, you get a changed perspective. So instead of saying, I had somebody tell me at one point when I was talking about finding funding for infrastructure for people walking and rolling, oh, well, you're telling me we're gonna have to do less. I'm like, really? Not for me. I'm not gonna feel like it's less if I have a place to ride my bike. So maybe you're just doing something different, and that's neutral. Change is neutral. Improvement is loaded. Improvement says it's qualitatively better, but then you have to ask for whom. So some of the measures might be better for some and worse for some, and you may be able to measure that, and you just need to say that so people understand what's happening. There is a very funny extra normal video. I use cartoons and like pop culture references all the time. So if you look up an engineer explains a project. Sorry, engineers, I'm really sorry. It's not you, it's somebody else who does this. But Strong Towns created this, and it's really, really funny because it is about improving the street. What do you mean improved? I mean that it will be straighter and wider, and extra normal is a little stilted, so it has extra humor value for that. But it really calls out, as you walk through, explain to this woman what you're doing to her street. Don't just tell her you're improving it, because it'll look like that. And yes, Ian, thank you again. I hope he's tweeting this. So improved for whom is a really big test. Changed for whom. This goes back a little bit to the science, although this is the math piece. When you're talking about a road reconfiguration, I don't know how many times I've heard people describe it as, well, we're going to take the street from 5 lanes down to 3 and add bike lanes. How many lanes will we have at the end of this project? We will, in fact, have 5. 2 of them are special purpose lanes. HOV lane is a lane, bus rapid transit lane is a lane, tolling vehicle lane. We have all kinds of special purpose lanes. A bike lane is a lane. So we still have 5 lanes. You only count it as 3 lanes if you are only counting lanes as being the ones that carry people in cars. So there's all this hidden car-centric stuff, and it's not on purpose, but it's there everywhere. And if you start to unpack it and say, well, like, lanes for whom? Who for the lanes? That sounds very Shakespearean. You can't do that one. Yeah, I'm not going to be that much of an English major. So you could just talk about what are the pieces of infrastructure we have there and who are they designed for? Who's using them and who needs them? This is another example of that kind of thing. Road diet. Personally, not a fan of diets. I like food. And when I think of diets, I think of things like iceberg lettuce. And nobody running a restaurant will ever put a picture of iceberg lettuce in their beauty shots. And like, that's just not a thing. You have to do a lot to iceberg lettuce to make it interesting. But you'll hear these references about road diets slowing drivers in the business district. Oh my gosh, must be inefficient if we've done that. And if you're going to really describe what's happening, I couldn't even fit it on this slide. So I gave it its own whole slide. It is a road buffet. And who doesn't love a buffet? So many things to choose from. And if you're gluten-free, you just stay away from the bread station, right? So if you don't bike, you don't use the bike lane. If you have a change in road configuration, completely neutral phrase, that does not say anybody wins or loses, and you go on to talk about it in terms of the benefits for all users, you're helping drivers if you're making sure that the design helps them drive at an appropriate speed, that gives them time to see people and stop instead of hitting people. I don't think anybody at the end of the day wants to go home saying, what'd you do today, honey? Well, I ran into somebody in a crosswalk. That's not a goal for people. So if the design is helping drivers observe the appropriate speed, then tell them that's a benefit. Don't say, oh, we're slowing you down, because that just sounds like an inconvenience. Helping you avoid a speeding ticket sounds like a good thing for you. So describe those benefits as you talk about this delicious road buffet, which is the kind of thing that your town will put in a marketing brochure when they show your cute downtown. Walked and biked in Portland last night, and those are the cute parts. You're not going to show your 6-lane suburban arterial loaded with a traffic jam. Another one of those words that shows up a lot is talking about any sort of active transportation infrastructure as an amenity. And an amenity is like the plushy robe at a hotel. It's nice to have, but you could still stay there and not necessarily have a plushy robe. So it's just infrastructure. It's all infrastructure. So moving on to when we talk about the whens of things happening to people or their use of transportation space, there are factors around time of day, seasons of the year, changes in the patterns of movements that people make that would be factors if you are looking at a story about why somebody got hit, where they got hit. Well, when did they get hit? And if you look at that and say, oh, they got hit at that, we're in winter, the days are shorter, there isn't any pedestrian scale lighting there. These are factors. If you are working on a project or a plan and saying, okay, is this the kind of place that has these seasonal fluctuations in people movements? Well, if so, maybe we should plan for that and call that out and say, oh, this is going to be a place where it's a park close to a school. That means that about the time that school lets out, we might have more kids coming through here. Where is a biggie? There are so many things about the where of things happening. There are the very specific locational factors. Are there crossing opportunities? So if you were talking about or reading a news story about somebody being hit, and it says 62% in Washington, 62% of our pedestrian fatalities are somebody crossing the road. So is that a crossing that they are making, in a lighted, signed, marked crosswalk? Or is this them trying to thread the needle on traffic because this is the only way to get across, to catch the bus on the other side? And very seldom will you see a news story that actually calls that out and says, well, they were hit crossing. Here's what it means to try to cross. Here's where there are no opportunities to cross. Seeing somebody in the street in a wheelchair because in that block there are no curb cuts on either end of that sidewalk. That's why they're in the street. There are the historical patterns we need to look at. And I would venture a guess that every city in America has a racist redlining history that you can overlay with infrastructure and you can see what has happened in the past, and we're reaping those results today. In those same neighborhoods that were disadvantaged over time, you have less infrastructure. You also have more people living in poverty, which means you have more people relying on walking and biking and transit to get around. And so what have we done? We've just doubled down on the problems. And if we don't say that's part of the story in infrastructure, we are not telling the whole story. There's a piece too about the kinds of streets. I think of streets as having sort of personalities. And if it's one of those arterials where some people just shot off the freeway, they're still sort of in the freeway speed mindset, and they're coming up to an intersection. There's an intersection in a town I used to live in that has the highest rate of collisions in the whole city. And it is that kind of street. It is an arterial that had an off-ramp, has bad line of sight, has a bunch of stuff going on. But you need to talk about that sort of character of the street to describe another reason that things happen there. And if you were describing this as a project, you would help people understand, well, if we make this a wider road, drivers are encouraged to speed by the very presence of that road width. I don't think you know that unless you've had to spend some time with it. The why questions, so much of the data we're seeing now talks about the impact speed. And this is not speeding. This is just how fast is the driver going when that front end hits me. And it's a little bit funny that this is currently illustrated with sedans, because car makers are going to stop making sedans and be making mostly SUVs, which are deadlier in a crash for the people outside. And again, this shows, the little walk icon. This is not showing us people in wheelchairs. We could probably rerun this data and talk about the combination of an SUV and people using an assistive device and have really even worse numbers. But the sheer physics are at 20, I have a 9 in 10 chance of surviving. At 40, you can flip-flop those odds. Now, in the state of Washington, I have to share some of our numbers, but we are not unusual as a state. Every state has a line that looks like this. And if I added 2012 before and 2018 after, you would still see that our trend is to have rising fatalities, not falling, despite the things we're doing. Now, all kinds of data problems. If I think like a scientist here, I have to say I don't have volume to tell you exposure rates. There are some problems, but the absolute numbers are going up. That's absolute numbers of people. One of the things in talking about how the words matter, the numbers matter, and how we present the numbers matters too. So this is pretty dry. And honestly, I could be talking to you about a rise in the sale of kale. And the number would probably be a steeper climb, especially if there's a snowstorm, like buy up all the kale. That's what happened in Seattle. But it doesn't give you a sense of what does that mean for me. So we can take those numbers and we can translate them into a meaningful comparison that's much closer to the way most people think about numbers. So I took our 2017 stats and said, what if it happened at an even rate all year long? And if it happened at an even rate all year long, then roughly every 15 hours, someone who was driving struck somebody who was walking or biking and either killed them or seriously injured them. And on average, every 3 days, somebody died. So if you do that and you say, look, if somebody didn't die yesterday and somebody doesn't die today, then on average, someone will die tomorrow. That is a very different understanding of the statistics than the dry line. I have looked at our preliminary numbers for 2018. They're up on our crash data portal, and these are not the final numbers. They haven't gone through all the scrubbing that we do for our data, but 2018 is no better. In fact, it's worse. The rate of collisions with these vulnerable road users is up dramatically. It is 10 times a day on average that a driver is hitting somebody who's walking or biking. And if you say that in a neighborhood meeting about whether or not we want a bike lane and say, look, around the state, 10 times a day somebody's getting hit here, then it changes the conversation. That brings it home for people. 2019, in fact, is off to a great start. And again, not confirmed numbers, preliminary numbers. In the first 40 days of 2019 in Washington, we had 9 fatalities and 30 suspected serious injuries. So that's 1 a day. And those are the kind of statistics I think people feel much more deeply, that they say 1 a day. That's could be me, that could be my kids, could be my mom. So with my English major for whom test, there's another thing you can do with this, which is to talk about if we flip-flopped this. Let's have some fun with this. Let's say, okay, we're going to turn it around and we're going to say we're designing this project to do this for, and then instead of saying for motorists, which you'll often see on a project description, this will decrease wait time for motorists. Well, can you say with a straight face, this will decrease wait time for people walking and biking? Maybe, maybe not. It's very entertaining to turn this around. So if you say, the road lane ends again, I hate sharing the track to the train. The smaller, slower mode is about to merge with the bigger, faster mode. That's how that feels. And I think it is okay to use humor in this. So with this idea, I put together some pieces and had some fun with this. So, you know, you have to put your name on things. So this is the Bechtel Blue Chamberlain transportation test. And any feminist studies people recognize? All right, there, I knew I'd have at least a couple. So, and I've read that Alison Bechtel said, it's not just me, but my name ended up on this test. It's the representation of women in fiction, and particularly in film. Are they shown as an active actor or not a passive object? Are they the subject of the male gaze? If they talk to each other, is it about something other than men? Do they actually have names? All of that. So I was on a panel with Ellie Blue and some others in 2012. There was a National Women's Bicycling Summit. And we did this panel on the representation of women in bike industry media, in particular advertising, but really anything. And we had magazines with amazing examples of how women were essentially, you know, the same test was being failed, I would say, by the bike industry. Did they show women riding bikes at all? If they did, or if they were around the bike in some way, were they shown as active rather than passive, kind of used as a prop in a lot of pictures? And if you flip-flopped the genders, would this be funny? And again, this was with a gender binary in it, but the test really was a good one, and it got a lot of guffaws in the room. So I took these ideas and I extended them to transportation and said, okay, let's look at our representations in words and in the images that we create and say, are we showing people of all ages and abilities using every mode on the street? Are they present? Are they represented? And by represented, I mean across kind of the spectrum of things that we do. Are we showing their modes as legitimate uses, or is this the little cute photoshopped in, because again, I'm trying to sell my town, so I'm going to show, you know, cute people doing cute things. Upright city bike with farmer's market, fresh veggies in the basket. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but is that showing like just or regular people riding bikes doing something? And if you reversed it, what would that feel like? I went through an exercise a while back. There was an NCHRP study, and they were asking us to look at street design renderings and rate them for how comfortable we would feel on that street. So I'm going through this, and these were enormous streets. And they were doing things like move the planter strip, you know, one side or the other of the bike lane and the sidewalk space and all of this. And I went through this whole thing, like rendering after rendering after rendering. None of them showed a person in a wheelchair. None of them showed curb cuts in their designs. So if you had put a person in a wheelchair in there, I don't know if the algorithm would do it, but the designer should have said, oh, wait, how are they going to get up on that sidewalk over there? Every person shown walking was walking at a very brisk clip. They're just flying across. These are not 85-year-old walkers. And so if you had put in somebody older and you had programmed in their average crossing speed, and then you show it to me, even though I'm not 85, how comfortable would I feel that street was? If I went, wow, she's not going to make it. The red hand of doom is starting to flash. So if you represent them, and then by doing that, you sort of force yourself to think about how that works for them, you're telling a different story. You're going to see some things. So if you did that, reverse the modes, you might say, oh, we need to increase the width of this downtown sidewalk. We have congestion and unacceptable wait times during peak hours. And I guarantee you, you will see that in descriptions of projects about doing things for people in cars. When we do value engineering and we cut things to cut costs, we cut amenities, we don't cut infrastructure. And after all, you know, we do want to make sure we take care of people in cars, give them that sense of safety and comfort through separation. And just to call it like it is. So you're going to think like a scientist. You're going to think like a good journalist and ask all those questions and answer them. And if you're somebody who's got some creative impulses, I think you can also think like whatever it might be. You're a novelist, an artist, a podcaster, a filmmaker. You're going to do some storytelling with those words. And now you're telling a richer story because you're including more people and more circumstances. As you're doing that, you need to respect the people whose stories you're telling and think of them as whole people, represent them as whole people, and provide that context. I'm not a podcaster, but when I've listened to podcasts, I love the way they find that little snippet of sound that gives me something. That works for me because I can hear. So think about in this storytelling, what are all the senses that might come into play or not for somebody, and how are you going to bring this to life for them? And when you tell that whole story, so this is a very typical line from a news article. Pedestrian was not in a crosswalk when she was hit by the car. Again, must be an autonomous vehicle because there's no driver in that sentence. what really happened to this woman. She's crossing to reach a transit stop on a stretch of road that has no marked crossings. It has no pedestrian scale lighting, 5 lanes. If it has a marked speed limit of 35, a traffic study would probably tell you they're more likely to be going around 40, 42. And maybe the bus she takes to work only runs once an hour. So when she sees it coming and she looks and she says, I can make this, and she makes an economically rational decision to try to get across the street, she ends up in this story as she wasn't in a crosswalk when she was hit. So tell that story. And it is a story with something for everyone. I think another thing we do, because so often we're so happy to have, they've added a scrap. They've added that little scrap for us. So we say, oh, we're going to add a crosswalk for pedestrians, or we're adding a bike lane for people on bikes. But really, when we do that, we are providing benefits for people driving too. We are making a street design that works better. And I think if we talk about those benefits so that people understand, oh, this isn't a takeaway, I'm actually benefiting from this. I will say I don't think everybody's going to buy it. I don't think everybody's going to see it that way. They may still see it as a takeaway. My fallback is when I get there on my bike, I don't take your parking space. And that works. I do have a bumper sticker. We have 1 car in our household, and our bumper sticker says, if I had biked today, this parking spot would be yours. So you can always use humor. One of the links we will be putting out, if we didn't already, is some work that was presented at TRB. Kelsey Ralph, Tara Goddard, some others did a really nice piece on the editorial patterns I was talking about. And they did a handout for TRB that said, if you're a planner or a transportation professional, you can actually prepare some things in advance so that if you got asked to comment on something, you probably, I will say, if you're working for a public agency, they don't want you speaking to the specifics of that incident. They're not going to say you should be diagnosing what happened there, but you can do all of the things about the context. You can say, in this area, we don't have pedestrian scale lighting. That makes it harder for drivers to see somebody. You can say, we have a pattern at this, in this city, more of our crashes take place on arterials. I don't even have to know which city, and I can tell you that's probably true. So you can add some statistical context and that kind of who, what, when, where, why, how picture, so that the reporter will do a better job if this is a reporter you're talking to. If you say, this is not just about this one person, this is about a national epidemic. This is about whether or not we have a complete network. You can help them tell the rest of the story because they didn't go to school for this. They don't know what questions to ask necessarily. And you can point to those factors. So in closing, with hopefully plenty of time for some questions, you can think like a scientist and a good journalist and a creative storyteller, and you can run this who, what, when, where, why, how test and say, did I answer those questions? And if I answered them, it has to mean I thought about them. And if you thought about them, you probably did a better design, a better plan, a better project. You made it work for more people who are really just trying to get somewhere and get home at the end of the day. So I will close there. And as always, I invite people to sign up for an e-news that I put out. Got some very Washington-specific information, but also a roundup of things like this webinar and other research and resources to keep us all learning how to speak the language that will include more people. So with that, I will stop for questions.
Great, yeah. I'll just ask if you wouldn't mind talking into the microphone so that folks on the online are able to hear your question. We would appreciate that. Is there someone willing to start?
Hello, I have a question about, you talk about you want to clarify but not blame. And I'm afraid that many motorists might still feel as if they're being blamed. So what strategies do you use to prevent vilifying motorists, I guess, in order to keep their support, because it's a majority of transportation people using transportation, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I just had that experience the other day as I was sharing the pedestrian fatality statistics, and somebody was just, you could just see him just like, he could not wait to say, but how many of them, like they stepped out or they wore dark clothes. Like he was just ready for that because I think he did have that sense. One of the things, depends on the town how much it's true, but it's pretty universally true, is the people who are walking or biking are also drivers. This is not separate Venn circles that do not overlap. So I think saying we all drive, and then like almost all, not everybody, but a lot of people have the experience of being drivers. So they're not the other. And I think, again, if we trying not to use that othering language should include them too. That is not a perfect solution, but that's a piece of it. So that you're saying, I have this in common with you. And here's my experience when I'm not the person driving, when I'm the person who is on the sidewalk waiting to cross, or the person in the bike lane hoping you're not going to right hook me because the bike lane continues through the intersection. I know I'm in Oregon, the bike lane does continue through the intersection, because so does that other lane right next to it, with or without paint. I think inevitably in any situation where you have a group of people who have privilege and have not had it questioned, and you question it, they feel as if they're losing something. And this is not just about transportation. And many people are struggling with that. So I think a certain amount of empathy, a certain amount of, would you want that to happen to somebody in your family? If you, I don't know that that's a perfect answer either. I do think it's tough. An appeal to self-interest too, to just say, if I have a place to be on the street, then we'll both know where I am and we'll both know where you are. And you don't want to hit me any more than I want you hitting me, might help as well. And if other people have things you've used that work, I think that's one of the hardest conversations I have. And it depends on the audience too. I will say I might talk about public health benefits, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, parking spaces, reduced congestion. Here are the ways in which what I want to do is good for you. And if it's safe for me, more people will do it and you will get more benefits, more empty parking spots if that's the issue. That's kind of a long causal chain for people to buy, unfortunately. It does actually work. It's induced demand. We know it works. But so I'm partway there.
Can you frame how aligned do you feel that your approach, perspective, and messaging is with WSDOT's overall PR communications arm, with huge agencies and structures like that? How would you characterize the alignment that exists now in that kind of messaging, or how well you are able to work with them in this kind of approach?
Yeah. Well, I'm fortunate to have it coming from the top. So Secretary Millar is the one making jokes about alternative transportation also. And he uses this kind of language when he presents anywhere, whether it's to the legislature, Transportation Commission, general public. Yesterday, I was at the Clark County Summit on Aging, and he talked and used this language. I've given this presentation internally and externally. I've talked with our communications folks. We are an agency of about 7,100 people. So it's not something that any agency would be able to do overnight. The thing you also learn coming into a big agency is how many sort of non-communications people are actually doing communications. So it's a project engineer who's writing a project description. And so we're trying to work with the communications folks, also with in each region office, we have somebody who has a responsibility for active transportation coordination. But honestly, the boxes are not always directly connected. They don't come around and say, well, I'd like to second guess your word choice here, which would not be the way to do that, by the way. I think there's a better way. What I want to work on is more templates that make it pretty easy to go through and say, have you fully addressed the benefits for every mode user? We also in our agency are talking about practical solutions a lot, which is our label on thinking through all of an integrated multimodal system so that you use the capacity you have. And if you're going to fully use the capacity you have, it does not mean every person moving into the state of Washington continues to drive alone. You have to talk about these other modes. So I think that capacity pressure is helping people think, oh, right, I'm supposed to think about this. I'm supposed to talk about this. So that's helpful. Some of this language is really, really widespread, so people will still talk about accidents. People actually sort of telling the rest of this story will still refer to accidents. So I think over time it's getting out there, and the more there are opportunities like this, and the more people inside their own agencies can start to turn that language, that becomes what you see in the documents. I tell people some of my job is, I like alliteration, it's more of my wordplay, invisible, incremental, institutional improvement, which is a mouthful. But what it means is you might not ever know I was there, but the words are different. And so when you read that checklist or you go through that design manual and it talks about all modes in a different way, it's being baked in. So I don't have to be there standing over your shoulder. So it'll be everywhere eventually.
Great. Any other questions? Yes.
wondering what has been successful moving towards Vision Zero in Europe and the kind of language we can use here to talk about and advocate for that.
Yeah. You know, I think a piece of that, certainly in Seattle a few years ago, there was some unfortunate terminology about things for people on bikes somehow representing a war on cars. I know if I go up against a car, I know who's losing that one right away, but reframing it to use that people language was part of what created success in Seattle, that you move away from this idea that these are warring enemies pitted against each other. I think that has helped. I don't know, since I don't speak Dutch or any Swedish or any of the languages in countries doing really good work on this, I'm not sure how it works for them in that thinking about the passive voice versus the active voice and saying the actor did this thing. And if they're doing this thing, why is that? And what could we do about it? Using the statistics to really clarify the whole context is what Vision Zero is really all about. It is data driven, and you would say, okay, we need to look at speed and separation. And if we do that and we design those self-enforcing streets, then we bring speed down, we do speed management in a way that saves lives. So it is both the tools and then how we describe them, I think, that's helping us. And we're working towards that. We have a couple of safety advisory councils. They have been separately focused, one on pedestrians, one on bicyclists. I clearly didn't name those groups. But they're going to come together and be an active transportation safety advisory council. And we framed our recommendation reports around the safe systems approach, 5 principles that are out of Vision Zero. So I think the more we start to talk about what we can do in that context, I think that helps too. There's another one.
Hi, Barb. I was wondering about your templates that you're developing and whether those are available for other public agencies to use. And then my second question was, are you doing any work with the press to try to get them? Do you have similar templates for the press? I feel like you see so many reports. There's an incremental change in the press. Some are doing it really well.
Yeah.
Others maybe not so much. So I think it can be very powerful if they're leading with this, and maybe it's coming from the police, which is another part of that. I guess maybe you could talk about what you've done with the Washington State Police.
Yeah. And I'm working on templates for us. So when I have them, and they'll also say things about how you justify traffic signals where you need them for a complete network. Just to give a shout out to Portland and Seattle for doing that work. I think, I don't know if a reporter ever wants to feel like they're writing something canned, but it could be great to give them an outline for, these are good questions you could ask. And gosh, this is Pulitzer Prize winning stuff if you really go after it. I know what is happening in a lot of them. If you look at them, what they are doing is taking the police traffic collision report, and it's almost a copy paste and saying this person, was hit. I don't understand why they use the passive voice so much, honestly. Bad writing. And here's the circumstances, and all they give is what's there. And the police, being maxed out, are not taking the time to look around. They're not trained to look around and say, well, the infrastructure conditions were this, this, and this. One of the things we did that's just a teeny tiny increment was worked on the collision report form for the police in Washington, where they would actually start noting the presence or absence of bike infrastructure. That wasn't even a thing being recorded. We can't even see it in the data. So I think there's some of that. Over time, working with them, they're involved in our safety advisory councils. I think they'll say we only have so much time on a call before we go to the next one. And then that's what the reporter is given to work with. So I think we have a couple of constraints there that are going to make that really challenging. But talking to reporters about how they cover it, Columbia Journalism Review did a really great piece saying, don't do the victim blaming story. And I think we could get that out there more to them.
Hi. I really appreciate some of the examples you gave dealing like mode choice descriptors. I was also wondering, when discussing equity, I've been struggling with choosing terms like low-income people or low-income households or poor neighborhoods or just automatically grouping like poor neighborhoods and communities of color, like they're just a package deal.
Yes.
I'm struggling. So any words?
I don't have a perfect answer for that. I struggle too. I think I try to be respectful in acknowledging the ways that historic factors have been compounded over time. so that it's not an automatic predictor. Some of this is causation. Some of this is multi-generational causation. That's not going to fit into the quick conversation I have with somebody. So I guess I would say I don't have a perfect term. We will often use sort of technical description, you know, the percentage of households above the poverty level. So I'm using government ease to define a community. Higher proportions of people living in poverty, people of color, people with disabilities, senior citizens. That's some of those demographics that describe people who have higher rates of injuries and fatalities. So I guess I would say I share your struggle. I try to be really respectful and inclusive, and yet acknowledge those are historic forces that we shouldn't, I guess, be so careful in the language that we don't acknowledge that this is a thing that happens to a lot of people who fit a particular description. African Americans get ticketed at higher rates for something labeled jaywalking, not a word I like. So let's say that, and say that's a pattern that needs to be addressed.
Okay.
We're approaching the 1 hour mark, so we have time for one more question, and then we'll say goodbye to our online viewers.
With the realignment of some of the language here, one of the curiosities I have is how that, because often grassroots movements and some of the community-based organizations are the most effective at both identifying some of the gaps in that, and also, you know, thinking back to like the Ghost Bike movement, something that we've seen a lot in Vancouver, British Columbia, where that is certainly for at high intersections of fatalities, we see that is a useful way of reminding people. So curious with this type of work, if how that's integrated into the communications integrated with the community and grassroots organizations. Mm-hmm. It certainly sounds like there's a strong top down approach with trying to realign this, but I'm curious in your work how that plays out.
Yeah, well, I came out of the advocacy world before working for WSDOT, so a lot of this really comes from my my spirit of being an advocrat. So again, working from inside, for any fans of The Incredibles, they have penetrated the bureaucracy. But the language around people first was from the advocacy community. So really a lot of what I talked about today, I want to make sure I give credit to the people I borrowed liberally from, and then I just kind of packaged it up in my own way. I think that's actually the people first language itself is kind of an interesting piece. I used to do work with a disability rights community when people first was the cry for the folks I was working with. And now you'll see differences of opinion about how somebody wants to be referred to, if they're a person with a disability or a disabled person. And that's an individual choice. So I think even in the advocacy community, kind of keeping up with where the language is, everybody has their own preferences. And so I think I want to try to work with that and collaborate with them so that we use the language that resonates and that brings it home for people. I hope that answered the question. Yeah, we are in it together. And at the same time, I work in a public agency that has its constraints, and part of my job is also to explain the constraints when I come up against them. And with that.
Great. Yeah.
I just want to take one from the web here, and it relates to the question we had earlier, so maybe it'll give you an opportunity to expand in a different way. And that is, how do we start to communicate equity, quote, in quotes, in a way that doesn't overgeneralize the term or make it sound too vague?
Yeah, you don't do equity and check a box. I think some of it is calling out that analysis of demographics, and actually saying it is really startling for people. I am a white woman. I am a middle class, cis. I mean, like I can go down the list of ways that I am who I am. And so for me to say it, I am using my position power to say these are things we should all be talking about. I think another more important way is to hire and promote and mentor people who bring those different lived experiences into the agency. I don't want to speak for people. I want to work with people. So I think that's the most important thing we can do as agencies too, or as professionals, is how are we doing our open house process? Is it one that's accessible to people? How are we making sure we go to where people are and engage with them there, instead of saying, come to us on our schedule, and no, we don't provide childcare or food at our open house, whatever it might be. I think it is a long effort to build it in, but I just think we have to ask the questions and look for the information that we can include every time. I will say, I think that's a stretch. I've had people ask how it is that equity is part of transportation work. I'm like, have you looked at the effects of transportation projects? We changed neighborhoods with the things that we built, and we should address those things now. So I think that's another thing working in transportation you can do is acknowledge the patterns and the displacement and the things that have happened, and just own it and move forward.
Great. Thank you to our audience for joining today, and a big thank you to Barb
Thank you.
Chamberlain.